Hi, my name is Aya Fakri, and I will be analyzing the extract of the tragic play Macbeth from Act 1, Scene 3. So, a little bit about Shakespeare was that he was a playwright between the year 1589 and 1613, and he was known for his many famous pieces such as Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Macbeth. In Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth, the witches reappear with the same presence as they did in Act 1, Scene 1, with the thunder in the background. With the appearance of the three witches, Macbeth was given three prophecies. The theme that I found in this extract was the idea of fate versus free will. Shakespeare uses these literary devices such as foreshadowing, descriptive and visual imagery, repetition, and a desperate tone to convey the theme of fate versus free will. The first line in this extract says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." This portrays the setting of the scene. The setting relates back to one that was evident in Act 1, Scene 1, where the witches raised a storm. And it's evident that it's a supernatural type of world that they are living in, and it just displays the theme of fair is foul and foul is fair, which is evident in Act 1, Scene 1 again. And it just shows that things don't appear to be what they seem. Also, because this is a theme that is very common in the play and it shows up quite a lot, I think that it's important to show that it can also foreshadow what will happen to Macbeth. Banquo goes on to describe the witches, as he says, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth. So Shakespeare uses visual imagery to recall the supernatural, and the witches are the supernatural beings, and as we know, they have qualities, and they have the ability to carry out specific things that humans could not do. So the idea of fate versus free will comes up again, as the witches have the ability to predict Macbeth's fate. However, fate lies in his own hands, whether he chooses to act on it or not. Shakespeare also uses repetition from lines 50 to 52 when the witches all say, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee," and each witch says something different. The first witch would say Thane of Glamis, which is his current title. The second witch said Thane of Cawdor, and the third witch said he shall be king. All hail is a common greeting, and it shows that the witches will betray Macbeth, and it alludes to when Judas betrayed Jesus. This foreshadows what will happen to Macbeth, whether he chooses to act on his fate or just let it be. However, once the witches give Macbeth these prophecies, automatically reveals his interest of him desiring to be king. And now that Macbeth has heard these prophecies, it is up to him whether he decides just let things be and let fate carry his course, or whether he puts his fate in his own hands. This is common in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, cycle of the tragic hero, and it leads to Macbeth's downward spiral as he decides to put his fate into his own hands, and as he stops at nothing to reach his ambition of being king. After Banquo hears these three prophecies that the witches have given Macbeth, he goes on to say, "Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? I, in the name of truth." This shows how Banquo is, in a way, wanting to know what there is for him in the future, and it's evident when he says, "That seems wrapped withal to me you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time." Wrapped withal is it kind of shows how Macbeth has been in a trance, and now that one of the prophecies for Macbeth had already come true, Banquo is more eager to hear about what the witches see in his future, which again brings up the idea of something that's supernatural, as Banquo is finally convinced that the witches can see the future. What they can't do is predict the true fate, because fate lies in the beholder, and it's their free will to act on the fate or just let it take its course. I also just wanted to add that the Weird Sisters, the word weird comes from an old English word, and weird meant fate, And I think that it's very significant because the weird sisters had the ability to look into the seeds of time and possibly determine and like predict the fate for Macbeth and for Banquo. However, they can't force anyone into doing something. However, they can persuade them into thinking in a different way, which is why this had an impact on Macbeth. Because unlike Banquo, he actually acted on what the witches had said because he really wanted to be king. Shakespeare uses a shift in tone when Banquo says, and this is line 61, and say which grain will grow and which will not. Speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate. Banquo in these lines, his tone shifts because he previously said that he didn't want to know about what was going to happen, but then towards the end he starts to change his mind, and that's because he's been persuaded and he's thought of things differently because he started to see that if things worked out well for Macbeth, then why not for him? So that's why he was curious, and he had asked the witches to give him his prophecies. And this idea of fate versus free will comes up once again. The difference between Banquo and Macbeth was that Banquo could really care less like what would happen to him in the future. He was just curious to know because one of Macbeth's prophecies had already come true. And I think the idea of fate versus free will is evident because Banquo shows that he's going to let fate take its course. However, he doesn't really see that that the witches have already impacted the way Macbeth views his fate because all he really wants is to become king, and he stops at nothing. And I think that it's just a big contrast between the characters of Banquo and Macbeth, and it brings up the whole idea of fair is foul and foul is fair, because Macbeth, although he seemed very hesitant at the beginning, he became very interested, and he wanted to keep talking to the witches to know how he could achieve his fate. Shakespeare uses repetition once again from lines 64 to 66 when all three witches say, "Hail, hail, hail," and it just alludes back to betrayal when Judas betrayed Jesus, and it's foreshadowing how the witches betray Macbeth. And although they don't have the ability to force Macbeth into doing anything, they do have the ability to persuade him to somewhat put his fate into his own hands instead of letting fate take its course. And this gives Macbeth a chance to put fate into his own hands, and this leads to his downfall as his ambitions completely overtake him in the end. In the last line of the extract, Macbeth says, "Stay you imperfect speakers, tell me more." Shakespeare conveys the desperate tone in Macbeth's voice, and at first, when Banquo and Macbeth saw the witches, Macbeth wasn't very interested to hear what they had to say until they brought up the prophecy of him possibly becoming king. And this is when he shows his reaction to the witches, and he immediately thinks of ways in which how he can achieve his ambitions to become king. And it starts to become incapable of self-control, and he goes against order, and he puts his fate in his own hands rather than letting fate take its course. With Shakespeare's use of foreshadowing, descriptive imagery, repetition, and of other literary devices, the theme of fate versus free will in this extract, particularly Act 1, Scene 3, this is where the downfall of Macbeth begins, and we start to see a different side of him, which also conveys again the reoccurring theme in the play, fair is foul and foul is fair. And this is where we see that Macbeth has his one quality that leads him to his tragic death, and his quality in this case is ambition, and he stops at nothing to become king.